Welcome to Prestige Conversations, courtesy of the Prestige Bookshop, Lavington. In this edition, we're going to be talking to the author of Riding with Giants, My Struggles with Modern Capitalism, the Lessons from Children, and the Joys of Cycling Fast. And that author is Peter Holmes. At the back cover, we read, when international businessman Peter Holmes left the executive world, he found himself living deep in rural France with only his 7-year-old twin girls for company. So many years later, he finds himself in Kenya. Welcome to Prestige Conversations, Peter Holmes.
Thank you, John.
Peter, your book is 344 pages. It was first published in 2020 in Australia by Viking, part of the Penguin Random House group of companies. And I'm going to take a wee bit more from the back cover, which is a guide to the would-be buyer. It transpired that you and your daughters finally began to put down roots in a French village and understand the beauty and calm of a small-scale existence and a very different approach to excellence and the well-lived life. And there's a follow-up with an endorsement by a gentleman, excuse me if I mispronounce his name, Roman Zaranik, a social philosopher and author of Empathy, who says of your book, this is the most original business book and parenting manual that you'll read this year, that year being 2020. Now, within the book, it says, my well-announced plan was to write a book of wisdom and keys to success while you were there. And in France, you're also going to undertake the non-professional lap of the Tour de France and do your body great physical harm.
True.
Yes. So if you set out to write a business book, how would you yourself describe the book that you ended up writing?
Oh, good question. I really did set out to write a business book. I started typing using some of the lessons and successes I'd had and conveniently leaving out mistakes I'd made or turning them into good lessons along the way. I started typing madly. I counted the number of words. I even put them onto a graph that would show how much I had to write if I was going to write a book, because I Googled how many words in a book. I mean, I was that fresh to writing a book. The problem was, as I started to write it, sitting where I was in rural France, watching people live and importantly work in a different way from work that I knew, I realized I didn't believe in a lot of the stuff that I was writing. And so I modified and then stopped writing that book and wrote a book about the search for excellence, a search for a different way of living. And then that fell into the context of business, which is the capitalist system as we know now, which caused me to have that struggle with capitalism.
Right, and in the midst of that, I'd be so forward as to suggest that there's a modicum of self-revelation that comes in. And I want to start off by reading to you the beginning of your book. The first lines, if it were. When I was 11, I was sent 2,000 miles from home to a boarding school on the other side of the continent, because apparently it was the best in the land. The school's extensive campus spread across a piece of southern Australian coastline. It occupied a low promontory next to Corio Bay, an uninspiring mouthful of Bass Strait, the turgid slice of ocean that separates mainland Australia from its island cousin, Tasmania. Its boarding houses, dining halls, classrooms, chapel, and decoratively fortified clock tower were red-bricked monuments to the way things have been and the way things were sure to stay settled, or, so was hoped, forever. More English than the English, it was an Antipodean facsimile of a British private school, a transplanted piece of Victorian certainty, full of dark corners and sharp edges, with strict rules for uniforms and uniformity. With nearly a century of operations, there was ample evidence of its authority and little room to argue. Its location had been chosen to fortify its students with daily exposure to the sea breezes of the Southern Ocean. Instead, the easterly winds brought the mildewy funk of the bay's decomposing seaweed, while the westerlies added the gaseous discharges of the Enterprise at the other end of the peninsula. The Shell Petroleum Refinery, proudly Australia's largest distiller of auto fuel. To those expected to be the country's future leaders, and one who stands to be the next King of England, the venerable institution provided all the requisite markers of the correct education. In reality, it was a morally bankrupt sportocracy with militaristic underpinnings and unenthusiastic religious instruction. Wonderful prose, but damning message.
Yes, a bit of a damning message.
I'd like you to expand on the kind of education that you had.
You know, we're sitting in a bookstore in Nairobi, and first of all, I've never had someone read that opening, very personal passage to me in my life. And to have it read by you is extraordinary. Any of the viewers out there will see that you have a better grasp of the English language than I do.
We'll switch from...
No, but seriously, your pronunciation is better than mine, and I think the reason that it so made my skin go into goosebumps is that Australia had a colonial past as well.
Yes.
Kenya has this colonial past.
Exactly.
The monuments may be a little fresher here because we got out 120 odd years ago.
Right.
You got out 60 something years ago. But the idea that the Brits came to Australia and made schools like Britain happened in Australia and like Kenyan. The idea that there are institutions like that, the idea that people thought things would never change, the sun would never set on the empire, that it didn't set and would never set on the empire and the empire would continue, was of course held for hundreds of years. And I was a product for that. Having read your bio, I know that you went to a school.
Well, there could be a moment of self-revelation in the sense that I went to the Duke of York, which is now Lenana School. Right. But in those days, it was a retread of the playing fields of Eton. Right. But I just want to go back to, I'll give you a quote from Graham Greene, childhood is the writer's bank balance. And since you've lived in France, I'll give you a quote from a French singer called Jean Ferrat, the great communist left-leaning Jean Ferrat, who wrote a very famous song called Nul ne guérit de son enfance, meaning no one is ever quite cured of his or her childhood. Right. I'm just wondering whether you, in Riding with Giants, are read-regging, self-curing of the effects of your childhood.
Yes. And I think any writer who pretends they're not doing that is fooling themselves. Or perhaps some get to a point where they have completely dealt with that, resolved that. But the part of the angst in all of us, part of what drives us, is what came from that very beginning. When you've outquoted me already, but something that George Orwell said, which was, serious writers are writing against something and for something. They've got an idea of what they're writing against, an old system, something they don't believe is right, for something, a new system, a new way of doing things, a new way of being. Yes, if you're a serious writer, if you really put time into your work, you're writing against something, some injustice or a system you saw when you were a kid, and something for something, and in that case I'm writing for a different way of looking at the world, different way of being. Yes.
there's this idea of self-revelation, and I'm going to, it's your book and obviously you know the contents. A Kenyan who went through a similar scenario, lots of bullying, the idea of making people real men. Do you still see yourself now, at whatever age, as a real man? I'll tell you why, because there are instances in your book where you admit, you'd say something like, and the tears flowed freely from my eyes. And that's because you've dropped your girls off late, or you couldn't give them quite the meal that they had anticipated.
Right.
And then I'm saying, oh my goodness, but this guy is admitting to crying. I thought, what a wimp. Tell you the truth, this should have been knocked out of you. I'd like you to comment on that idea of masculinity, because it's very much Barack Obama's having chats with it with Bruce Springsteen. So let's have our chat about it. What would you say?
Well, I mean, if you go back to that school system, and then if you go to that school system and put that school system that was invented during the Industrial Revolution, and the idea was that those schools were designed to prepare little soldiers of commerce going off to the factories to not care about their workers, for the betterment of the country. They weren't evil. They weren't done in an evil way. It was just seen that economic progress would be what's better for the country. Some would go off and they would spread the empire out of England as missionaries. Some would go and work for the English Royal African Company, and they would come out here to do business, or some would go into the mills in Manchester. And it was, the idea of those schools is they would prepare you to not have feelings, as they would get in the way of you doing a good job for Queen and country.
Right.
And so, yes, part of the job of the school was to beat out of you things like emotions.
Right.
So you wouldn't have those, because that wasn't in the interest of the system.
But you seem to have recovered them. At what point did you recover them?
Well, I don't think they were fully successful in getting out of them. I think getting them out of me. I think my wife would say that I've still got a long way to go, and I think having children is one of the things that makes you really realize that there's a benefit to having emotions. The more you feel, the more you can enjoy. The more you hurt, as a result, the more like you are to cry at delivering the wrong meal to your girls and seeing the forlorn look on their face. But it's worth the pain to have those feelings.
Page 165, boarding school syndrome. Kids were taken miles from home, plonked into an artificial environment with little adult supervision, develop a strong habit of working out things themselves, even if they get it wrong, with nobody to ask, no parent to explain. Children overdevelop the skill of making up explanations for the world. Inside your head becomes your only real safe space. Is that alternative speak to you only listen to yourself, you make your own decisions, and what Peter Holmes, a court things deemed necessary as the next step, you're not going to take any advice from anybody. A certain tunnel vision, a certain selfishness.
Yeah.
Would you agree?
Yeah, it's absolutely.
Because we're talking peer to
no, absolutely. It's a
because I'm accused of that in my family.
No, it's a weakness that I know that I have. It's a weakness I know that I have, and I'm fortunate. This writer from England, Joy, who wrote about boarding school, syndrome, is yes, you're sitting there, you've got no one to explain the world to you, your brain is maturing as a teenager, so you have to work stuff out. But there's no one to ask or no one to give advice, so you get really good at the habit of making up the logic, making up the answer, and then being stuck on that answer. Yes, I suffer from a little bit of that. I try to openly empower the people who work for me, the people in my company, draw up examples from people, but I suffer for a little bit from concluding the answer that I'm looking for, and then having to change the answer at a later stage. Absolutely.
Well, my plan for myself, which I'll share with you, is to leave the latter part of our conversation to this capitalism, the main, but I'm still drawing on the aspect of self-revelation, which takes me to father-son relationships, selfish questions, because I would have had what I'd discover a fraught, distant relationship with my father. And then I spend a lot of time trying to be worthy of his consecration. Right. It seems to me that you had a deep relationship with your dad. He was a very funny man. Yeah. You obviously admired him a lot from afar. He was very witty. He was very a man of the world. But he died of a stroke, I believe, when you were 21. Yeah. So that would be about 31 years ago. Right. Then when Dad goes, the point of reference disappears. Yes. How have you lived that sort of male conundrum?
Oh. Another hard question. I think bumbled through it. I didn't prepare myself for his departure. It happened very suddenly. He was the absolute center of my universe. I think I've done a combination of, only seeing the good in him, then a combination of seeing all the wrong that he did and being angry with that. I think I'm in the bit of a balance stage, Ultimately, it was selfish of what he did to not look after his health. He had people and family who depended on him and would have done better in life if they had more of him. So I don't think I'm angry, but I also don't think I worship him in some of the ways that I did earlier. Yeah. I also know how fortunate I was to get what I got.
From him?
From him, absolutely. So fortunate. So, I do know that.
I'm going to take you, Peter, to page 204. You can see that I have a biblical relationship with your book. Page 204. Yeah. You're talking about, I was CEO of a public company, proudly the largest to lead a business of that size on the Australian Stock Exchange. I'd run fast towards a role like that, but when I got there, it didn't take long to understand that the 7-figure remuneration was in return for a bit of my soul, and most of the time I would otherwise have devoted to my family.
Right.
Like father, like son?
Yes. Yes.
Unknowingly.
So what you're saying, exactly. So I ran myself quickly to a job, as you said, youngest leading a company of that size in Australia, only to discover that it meant that I would not get to see my kids, and I would be away a lot and they'd be growing up without me. I got out, my dad didn't. My dad stayed in. Now he tried to, and he came with a very, very different set of challenges. He came as an immigrant to Australia.
From South Africa?
From South Africa, or from Southern Africa.
From Southern Africa, Zimbabwe.
Zimbabwe, Botswana, right. And South Africa, where he was born, lived, educated in those 3 countries. And so he came, saw himself very much as an immigrant from parts of the world that were not popular in Australia, and he came with far more disadvantages than I had, and so I was able to get out, but I was fortunate enough to be able to get out.
You mentioned people within your family. Obviously, it's based, it begins with a moment of schism in your life where you're going through a separation, possibly ultimately to a divorce, which isn't dealt with here. And I would like very much to concentrate. I'm talking to you as a writer, not as a psychologist or psychiatrist. Right. So let's stick to riding with giants. You mention people like your former wife and your brother and other members of the family, but we never hear them speak. You never, as a writer, introduce dialogue into your description of people. So if your wife, if Devon ex-wife had gone off the train and said, "Oh, Peter, your shoelaces are undone,"
Right.
And that was the first thing she said upon meeting.
Right.
Then we could sort of get an idea of the friction that had pertained,
Right.
because she's like that.
Right.
But Uncle so-and-so comes to visit within that time in the rural village, and he says, lovely with the children, but yet again, we don't have him say, okay, I've been to the supermarket, and I know you don't have any in between time, but I've bought 20 kilos of chocolate for everybody. Come on, girls. Come on, Elsa. Come on, Addison.
Right.
So why don't you do this? Why don't you paint these people for us?
Okay.
My own answer to your question is that you were a rookie writer and had no idea what to do, so that kind of skill hadn't passed on to you.
Right. Do you want to stick with that as an answer?
No, I want yours.
You want to okay.
Yeah.
Here we go.
Yes.
Here we go. And are you ready for this?
Yes, I am.
Okay. And I'm going to be completely honest with you.
Well, honest with the viewers.
No, I'm going to be honest with you.
Yes, okay.
I'm going to be honest with you because you asked the question, right?
Okay.
Okay, I'm sitting in a bookshop, right? I'm sitting in a bookshop in Nairobi, the prestige bookshop, right?
Yes.
I look around these walls and there's about a dozen writers here who I know, right? I see that guy, John Green, Fault in Our Stars, amazing younger guy. Neil Ferguson around there, history's amazing writer. Yvonne, my God, amazing.
Dust, the Dragon
amazing. I'm going to keep saying amazing writer. Right. Blows my mind. Yeah. Sometimes, I'm going to say this out loud, I feel like a fraud, like I snuck in here. Like Penguin put all my words in a thing and a cover and put it on.
That's not an excuse for not creating dialogue to make your characters come alive.
The idea that when you write a book, you know what you're doing is crazy. I just started writing this thing. I didn't think it was my job to put words in anybody's mouth. If they want, I might make a mistake. I might get it wrong. Let them write their stories. I just wrote what I felt was really there, and that was the bits. I used to take notes every single day. I used to write every single day so that everything in this book, I believe, I can stand behind, and it was not an invention. These things really happen. I really tell the stories exactly as they are. I wish I had the capacity to write dialogue like you can, like Yvonne can, like these other writers can. I wish I had that capacity. My skills lie in perhaps elsewhere. Perhaps it's up to the reader to work out whether they like it or not, but my skills lie in a larger picture of the world, knowing that I can't pick up some of those nuances in the dialogue. I can't put them on page as well as other people can.
Right, so there's a humility, there's a trait that's always much lauded. I'll stick with that answer. Okay. I'm going to accuse you, or others might accuse you now, Peter, of betrayal. You're a traitor.
Okay.
Because it's become clear to you that, and to us, that you're an Australian, first, yes. Whatever else you may become else. And this is how you write about your motherland.
Right. Oh, here we go.
The pavilion was a display. You're in Shanghai. And you're at a conference. You're with your Prime Minister.
World Expo, 2010.
Right.
Yes.
The pavilion was a display of how Australia likes to see itself, or at least likes to promote itself. A country full of modern medical advances, a land of abundant sporting achievements, high-end chefs, and solid mining prowess, all of which was tastefully mixed with indigenous art and respect for the hard workers who built our country. On the pavilion's top floor was the main attraction, a 360-degree cinema where a series of rotating and spinning videos screen an animated film featuring 3 cartoonish children, one white, one black, one Asian, discovering everyday life in Australia, a multicultural paradise with lots of sun. Lots of sun. There was no mention of the darker periods of our history. Left out was the precipitous fraying of the country's social fabric, the decline in mateship, the less than friendly welcome given to those that arrive by boat today, Also left out of the history was any mention of the incarceration of the first men to attempt to organise English workers who were sent as convicts to the colony of New South Wales, nor was there any allusion to the resulting slow-motion genocide of the continent's traditional residents.
So World Expo brings together, countries from all around the world that build these massive pavilions. They spend $100 million on their pavilions to highlight the countries and do a bunch of trade, to bring some tourists in, to project the images they want to project of those countries to citizens of the world. What would Kenya put there? They would say it's a multicultural paradise. They would have black, white, and Indian.
Maasai warrior with a spear.
They would definitely have a Maasai warrior.
A lion.
They would say open plains.
Yes, exactly.
Right? Now, as they were presenting themselves to the world, they would not have the exhaust pipe of the matatu spraying out into people's faces as they arrived. They wouldn't be showing the incarceration that the British did of the first freedom fighters here. Countries have a habit of taking those issues and pushing them aside, like all of us on a first date, like all of us, when we're impressing a room full of people. So did I, in that passage, sound overly negative on the extraordinary little country that Australia is? I was giving balance and saying, we do have amazing chefs, incredible sporting achievements. We do mine a lot. We are a technologically advanced country. We have all these things. But there is a part, and I think we'd all be better if in ourselves and if our own countries, we would recognize the other sides that went on without saying we're responsible for it, without saying that we feel bad about it, without living in, shame, but really being aware of everything on the negative that also underpins everything on the positive.
Thank you. That's a good, I think Americanese is a good segue. But the segue is that you're now, and in your own words, you have this moment of, you leave all that behind, but you go away with two twin daughters and you are abandoned or leave, or whichever adjective, let's troll through the dictionary and the thesaurus, you leave the boys with mum. A highly patriarchal society, the idea of the heir and the spare, very shocking to me as an African, is that you leave your sons behind.
Right.
Comment, if you would.
I come from cultures that are what we like to say more progressive.
Oh dear.
Where I know, don't take that as a slight. Right. More progressive, and perhaps boys' time with their mother actually can help them grow into more fulsome individuals. Your comment before about being a man, being perhaps an old structure, perhaps there's other ways of doing this, and we will learn and we will look back in 50 years and see whether that was a good idea or not.
Right, so it was thought out. We're now Peter, we have 15 minutes to our disposal. We have what would have been the book that you ended up writing, which is a criticism of capitalism per se. And in your own words, you go off to France, you go off to a tiny little village where, for whatever reason, your mother had bought some property. Yeah. We've got to go back. You're not a poor Australian, because in Wikipedia, Google will tell us that your father was Australia's first billionaire. I'd like to ask you whether everywhere you go, Peter, whether people just see you as a cash cow. How best can I get Peter Holmes a court to pay my bills if I befriend him? Yes. Do you have that problem? I'm asking you some very personal questions, but it seems to me like they're the obvious ones to ask. Yes. Everybody knows you're rich.
Yes, well, that disappoints people. That Wikipedia is not always accurate. There you go. Number one. Number two, I was in a lot of ways very fortunate. So if I said those things about the boarding school and bullying and things like that, we all have childhoods where we have good and bad things that happen to us. And part of my experience in my life was extraordinarily positive. From my relationship to my parents, to the opportunities I got, to the universities I studied in America and at Oxford and the UK, part of those experiences is I'm incredibly fortunate.
And I'm trying to suggest this idea of people to take advantage of you. Is that a quotient? I don't appreciate that. Nobody has ever accused me of being very rich, but if you are, do you find that within that you have real relationships? Your Elton John, your Paul McCartney, your Mick Jagger. Do you have real cronies? Do you have real mates? Or do you just have people who want to sponge off you?
Yeah, I mean...
Sorry for the people who are listening who might be considered themselves to be your real mates.
Yeah, I do. Actually, I do think I have a lot of real mates. And I do think I'm real... Matesses. And I do think I am real with those people. I do think I have a little bit of an overdeveloped skepticism. That makes me think if someone's nice to me, why are they being nice to me? And I think that has hurt me in my time.
That's why I'm being particularly cruel to you in this intervieh. I just wanted to know no handouts to him.
No, I pushed a lot of people away because I am skeptical of whether and why they like me. So look, I don't know the answer to that question. I'm not really good. That's area. You talked about area that we all do to I don't know what you call to restructure or reform or come together as different people. Growth. Yes. That's part of the growth I'm still doing. So,
right.
And it's I live in Kenya as what they would call a Mzungu, and I've had people work for me who have pretended to be injured so I would give them some money. And I had a guy work for me yesterday who got hit by a boda boda, and my first thing was, let me see the bruises, right?
Yes.
Instead of taking his word for it,
right.
And my trust was blown before.
Right.
Now, the guy who had been hit by a boda boda is an employee that I really, really value. And afterwards I kicked myself. Why did I not just take his word for it? So it's complex. When you're a Mzungu living here, it's particularly complex.
Absolutely. Right. But we'll get to Kenya towards the end because we're going to stay with Riding with Giants. Why the title, by the way? I was trying to work out are you the giant? They're riding with you.
Well, with it's with me, right? So with it's with me. So it's riding with giants, and it's really.
And who were the giants?
So the giants, and this goes back to this question about capitalism. So much of the world that we live in, was created. The structures of what we're created, the giants who created that structure are the ones that my eyes were open to when I was in France.
Like your friend Jean-François Caille, the father of modern day globalization.
Well, he was one of the fathers of it. He was one of the fathers of rail in Europe when that was a really big deal. And these people helped create the firms, helped create the structures, the towns, elected the officials. And the idea was, as I was riding my bike in France by myself, thinking about these people, I began to realize that we lived in their world. Now, the good part about this story, and this is the point about capitalism, this version of capitalism is a version that we created. So if we want a different version of it, it's completely within the power of humans to change the version of capitalism that we've got and create this world. This is just a figment of human endeavor, human ideas, things that we thought would work at one stage, things we realized weren't working.
But go back one and explain, when you got to this little village in France, sorry, because I took my question, Mum's bought a house there a long time ago, she's with the partner, they take you there to sort of find out what it's all about, leave you to your own devices with your two 7-year-old twins. Yes. And you stay there and you write by day, this book, and you supervise the building of a very nice bicycle in a factory, and you are going to use this custom-made bicycle to do the étape du tour, going up 100-degree inclines, but as a non-professional. And first of all, Peter, I'm talking your book to you, you discover a new way of life in France. What did you discover? And then 2 seconds to the end, I'm going to say, why did you ditch that wonderful paradigm and come to Kenya? But that's beyond that will be the bit of self-revelation about how you've traveled since.
Okay.
But it's not riding with giants. Let's stick to France. Okay. Let's stick to France.
Okay. So, there were two parts of your question.
I think so. Maybe 10, I think. Exactly. Convoluted questions.
Exactly.
Should get better at that.
Yes. Well, I'm going to narrow it down to the two that I want to answer. Number one is this funny little house in France. Number two is a bicycle factory and the appreciation of quality and artisan quality. So this funny little house in France. So it turned out it was formerly a school. It was a school for reforming children. Reforming children who in the 19th century had committed small crimes, and they were going to be reformed through the application of hard work and family love. And that was at that time a radical idea. You've got to remember, at that time in Europe in the 19th century, a person who committed a crime was considered to be of no value. They were in their core a criminal. It wasn't possible to reform. There was no possibility of human change. Your actions, or the shape of your head, or the look of your eyes, determined who you were, right? So this house really is a metaphor for the ability of us to change. And I discovered that the man who built it was an early, very forward thinker. The people who thought in the 19th century that you could change yourself, they were radicals. And that a lower class person could change himself to the top of society. Well, of course, the man who built this had been born on a mud floor, and he ended his life in the biggest mansion in Paris. And he did it in one generation. And that was the first time the Industrial Revolution.
That is Jean-François Caille.
It was the first time that people were able to do that. Before that, you couldn't rise to the top of society because there was no machines to do it with, and the royalty would make sure you got knocked on the head before you got there. So the Industrial Revolution and the opening of society made it possible for people to advance from a dirt floor, where people in Kenya are still born onto a dirt floor. In France, it doesn't happen very much, I can tell you today, but it did in the 19th century. You could be born on a dirt floor and end in the biggest house in the capital city. So Kai became one of the giants that I started to ride with. Rudolf Diesel, who thought he was going to change
the diesel engine.
The diesel engine. Thought he was going to change the world.
Yeah, Mercedes-Benz, Benz, and then named it after his daughter. That's all in your book.
So they thought that they were going to change the world for the better. Sometimes they changed it for the worst without knowing what they were doing. So the first was this funny little place. The second was finding this bicycle factory where I saw the artisans first there, then I saw artisans in stone houses and woodwork and in metalwork, working with the most extraordinary precision and taking joy out of what they did for a job. And so much of work has been devolved into only what it does for you, what you get out the other side, the money you get for it, and not for the joy of doing it really well. And that took me back to the history of artisans, the history of trades, and to understand...
Which you explain in some detail.
And I hope without putting people to sleep. Yes. So that I hope that people understand that we used to really respect work and work for the quality of that work and work for hours to get the quality. And that's where a lot of our reward came from in what we were doing. And so I try and tell that story and weave that story into my own transformation.
Our final 5 minutes.
Yes.
Your great love for France, the idea of a devolved system of governing. Things are always working on a very, very small scale. Mm-hmm. Kids get to have a day off on a Wednesday so that you can spend time with them. Yeah. They're using nuclear power plants to limit sort of the idea of industrial waste, etc. Yes. You're in love with this culture. But I'm asking, in your book, that leads me to say, this is where I want to be. But you didn't write the moral equivalent of, Marx and Engels, there was a thinker, and then came Peter Holmes a court. You don't give a viable substitute for capitalism. You just say that certain ways of living are admirable, and then you don't end up taking up French citizenship. I thought that was a kind of, what is the word? I'll pick up my thesaurus later, but I was let down.
Let down
by your not being French.
Right.
Now.
Well, I thought you'd be excited that I'm Kenyan now. I thought you'd be excited that I've come here to...
Well, explain the transition, because it's not in the book.
No, it's on the book. It's happened afterwards. Afterwards. But I'll just give you that.
Yes, yes.
I'll just give an answer to the first question, which is, I appreciated the system that was there as it worked for people who were there, as it worked for the community, as it worked for the towns. I appreciated that system, and that devolved system, you're absolutely right, the smallest administrative systems in the developed world come out of France. And it really is a way of managing a society. It wasn't right for my kids. Turned out, years later I fell in love with a photographer who works across Africa, and she brought me to Kenya. That's the answer to that question.
Right.
I followed my love to Kenya. But that I respect and like that system, and I see so many good things in the French system. Doesn't mean I have to live there. I can tell you good things about Bhutan.
Why wouldn't you recommend it as a system for the rest of the world? Why aren't you saying, because you obviously don't like...
Yeah. Great question. Okay. Each system has to fit the culture of that country. You can no more take the American system and put it in Bhutan as you can take Bhutan's system and put it in Tanzania. Organization systems for society have to come deeply from the culture of the country. And I love that about the world. I don't want every country to be on the American, on the French, on the Bhutanese or the Tanzanian system. I don't want them to be on those. I want everyone to have their own system. That's the beauty and the fascination of the world. As you travel places, you see different things. People organize themselves in a different way. When America took the lessons of the French philosophers and wrote down, live free or die, that was liberty at any cost. When the French said it's liberty, equality, and fraternity, they said we want all three of those things. Equality is important, and fraternity or community is important to us. America went one way, France went another way right around that time. Each country has got to have their own set of values, and they then run themselves that way, and that's totally fine with me.
We have to stop there. Peter Holmes a court.
Great.
Thank you very much for being on Prestige Conversations.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. How about that? Okay, take care.
Prestige Conversations came to you from the Prestige Bookshop, Lavington, and you can buy Riding with Giants by Peter Holmes a court from the Prestige Bookshop. I invite you to do so, and if not that, just please read. Thank you.